Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Art Day of the Tiqets Culture Festival. I'm Rachel. I work at Tiqets, and we're so pleased to have you today. We're so proud to welcome the Met for this tour of their Making the Met exhibition, which is a 150-year history of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the new exhibition is slated to open this fall. So we're so excited to give you a little sneak peek today. So with that, I am so thrilled to transport us all to New York City today and to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm going to start by showing just a little clip of a video about the exhibition, which we're going to learn a little more about, and then I'm going to turn it over to Laura. So first, let me quickly share this video as we are transported to New York City.
Wow, that's a very famous painting.
Great. Laura, I can't wait to see what you have in store with us. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Hello, and welcome to this virtual visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My name is Laura Corey, and I'm the Senior Research Associate in the Director's Office and European Paintings at the Met. You can see here on the screen our great museum, which is not, as you may imagine, where I am today, but I'm delighted to welcome you on a virtual tour of the Metropolitan Museum of Art on occasion of our 150th anniversary. As you just saw, 2020 has marked a major milestone for the museum, both in ways that we long anticipated as the 150th anniversary of the founding of the museum, and also in ways that we never could have predicted as we found ourselves in this unplanned moment of global crisis that we're navigating in real time with the rest of the world. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a brief moment to thank you for joining me today. I hope you and your loved ones are all safe, and would like to acknowledge especially those who have been affected by the coronavirus and everything else going on in our world around us. But here we are. So what you see on the screen is a view of the Met BC, before coronavirus. You see the majestic building on Fifth Avenue, flanked on three sides by Central Park, with a view of the Midtown skyline that's a reminder of what an important place the Met has in the city of New York. You see a plaza teeming with visitors, taxi cabs outside, colorful banners promoting the latest exhibitions. And while much of the on-site activity has been quieted since we closed on March 13th, it is still a very active institution. We're all working hard, near and far, and very much looking forward to the moment when we can welcome you all back to our dear building. I too have been away from New York for a while and only recently returned, and it was so striking to me walking back up to the museum how important and inspiring this place is. It's still standing, not only after 150 years of its history, but also after everything that's happened in these past few months. It's still a beautiful place. It's still so full of potential. And we're all thinking now, as much as ever in our history, about what the museum does, who it serves, and how. So this is an exciting moment that I hope you will be able to join us for in the coming months. So I'm here today particularly to talk about our exhibition, Making the Met, which was planned to commemorate the 150th anniversary, and in fact was scheduled to open just 10 days after we were forced to close because of the virus. Now, the plan is that the exhibition will open hopefully in the next couple of months when the museum reopens, and that it will run through the rest of the year. So I very much hope that many of you will be able to come see it in New York. Making the Met is conceived to tell the story of the history of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which of course is something that you can do in many different ways. This was a remarkable collaboration of staff across the museum, and I had the great honor of organizing the project with our Deputy Director, Andrea Bayer, and an advisory committee of curators, educators, archivists, conservators, and all of our staff to come up with what we thought might be the best way to tell this story through an exhibition. What we landed on was the concept of 10 transformative moments in which the DNA of the museum shifted. Its priorities were established and redetermined. Major acquisitions came into the museum that redefined the collection. There's stories of education, engagement with artists, international outreach, and even some of the missteps that we made along the way that we affectionately sometimes call our Met regrets. We wanted to tell a lively, immersive, and three-dimensional story about the transformation of this institution over the past 150 years. So what I'm going to do now is give you a behind-the-scenes tour, a sneak peek of stories that are presented in the 10 major galleries of the exhibition, some views into the show, which we had to abandon mostly but not completely installed at the time of our closure, and a look towards things to come in our future. So thanks for joining me, and let's virtually go into the Met. I first want to take you back to the moment where it all starts, the founding decades. So the Met was conceived as an idea by a group of civic leaders, businessmen, and artists in the wake of the Civil War, with the idea that art could inspire anyone who had access to it. These founding trustees established the museum for New York City and its public without a single work of art, with no building, with no staff, just these great aspirations. This is different history from many of the European forebears of the museum that inspired those first trustees. Collections like the Louvre and the Prado were cultivated over many generations by royalty that brought in great works of art, then transformed into public collections. At the Met, we started with nothing. So that transformation is a major storyline, from no works of art to nearly 1.5 million objects in the collection, from no building to a building of over 2 million square feet on Fifth Avenue, in addition to our location at the Cloisters uptown for medieval art, and our temporary location of the Met Breuer for modern and contemporary projects. And also a staff that started with no people and is now over 2,200 people who are dedicated to serving the institution. After the museum was incorporated on April 13th, 1870, what we acknowledge as our birthday, the trustees quickly set about forming this collection. The collection was wide-ranging and global from the start. They wanted to collect and display works from all cultures. Some of the major early acquisitions include Cypriot antiquities acquired by the Met's first director, Luigi Palma di Cesnola, an Italian-born and then military officer who served in the American Civil War, in fact, even endured Confederate confinement in jail, and then went on to excavate as American consul to Cyprus. Also, the so-called founding purchase of 1871 of 174 old master paintings, represented here by Van Dyck's St. Rosalie. We have works by the founding trustees themselves, including Frederick Church, whose painting of the Parthenon you see here. Church also contributed to the museum 2 Mexican Toltec reliefs, representing his idea that the museum should collect not only the art of the United States, but also of the Americas. From Europe and America, the collection stretched to Asia, with Japanese armor collected by our very interesting first collector of arms and armor, Bashford Dean, who trained as a vertebrate zoologist before turning his childhood passion for armor into a career in the museum. And precious small jades collected by longtime trustee Heber Bishop, showing the diversity and eclectic nature of building the collection in the early years. This was also an important period of architectural transformation. Awaiting a permanent location on the site assigned by Central Park architects Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, the museum occupied two temporary quarters. First, on Fifth Avenue between 53rd and 54th Street, very close to the present-day location of the Museum of Modern Art from 1872 to 1873. And then on 14th Street on the west side, which you see here in a painting by Frank Waller that is included in the exhibition. This was the museum's home from 1873 to 1879. And if you look closely, you'll recognize in this painting, that painting by Van Dyck that I mentioned previously, St. Rosalie. I'll pause briefly on this work of art because it has become an unplanned mascot for the exhibition. It was painted in 1624 when the artist himself was in quarantine due to an outbreak of the plague in Sicily. The remains of St. Rosalie had been discovered near Palermo, the city for which she was patron saint. And Van Dyck was inspired to paint this gorgeous work of the saint praying for, representing her people during this time of plague. I encourage you to look up the article by Jason Farago in the New York Times from late March. It's a poignant piece about the significance of this work of art, especially in this moment when it is on lockdown effectively in the Met during our time of the coronavirus. Finally, in 1880, the Met opened its doors on Fifth Avenue. In a video feature that will be both in the exhibition galleries and on our website, we explore the full architectural history of the museum, from ambitious early plans to the Victorian core, to the classical facade and Great Hall that debuted at the turn of the century, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, and later into the most recent transformations of the building. I encourage you to look out for that on the website in the coming weeks. A special feature for those of you who come to the exhibition is that for the first time in more than 20 years, we're opening a window onto Central Park, which reminds us of the importance of the museum site in the park and in the city, connecting what's in the galleries to what's going on in the world around us. And a second window that overlooks the Carroll and Milton Petrie European Sculpture Court, which completed the museum's footprint in the park in 1990, and looking across at a facade from 1888, the second entrance of the museum when it was on Fifth Avenue. So once the museum was firmly established around the turn of the 20th century, a new era began. Chesnola, the first director, died, and a new crop of trustees came in to expand the aspirations of the institution. The second section of the exhibition, called Art for All, looks primarily at three collections that represent the encyclopedic and educational aspirations of the museum at this time. The mission of the museum to educate artists, students, and the population at large was of foremost importance to this generation of leadership. This collection that you're seeing on the screen now was the collection of musical instruments, one of the early global collections of the museum, and formed by one of its first important female patrons, Mary Elizabeth Adams Brown. It's known as the Mrs. Crosby Brown collection of over 3,000 musical instruments that she acquired from all over the world. I'm showing you here not only the early galleries, but also a raven rattle from Native American culture in British Columbia, and a sangak, a Burmese kind of harp. Mrs. Brown was adamant that when she collected these objects, although the collection included examples of rare beauty, it was their educational quality to demonstrate the history of music all over the world that was of utmost importance. In order to catalog this large collection, Brown encouraged the museum to hire its first woman professional, Frances Morris, who was previously working as a secretary for a Presbyterian minister. Morris became a tireless advocate for the museum and these early educational collections. In 1906, when she finished cataloging the musical instruments, she moved on to the Textile Collection, another early collection with global scope. You can see Miss Morris here in the black dress at right, handling fabric in the textile study room, which she established in 1910 to welcome artists and especially designers, fashion and textile designers in New York's booming garment industry, to come into the museum and study firsthand samples of textiles from across time and around the world. I'm showing you here a chair seat cover that was designed in India in the 18th century for the European export market, as well as an ancient Peruvian tunic with an emblem of catfish. Through both purchase and gift, this collection grew rapidly to be one of the large and broadly representative educational collections at the museum. Another important collection formed with similar principles was the collection of prints first established by William Ivins, a Harvard-trained lawyer before he came to the museum. Ivins believed in the potential for prints, not just masterworks, but also more ephemeral and popular print media to inspire artists. He too established a study room in 1917 where artists could come and study an enormous range from high to low of all different kinds of print media. This is still the collecting philosophy of what is now our Department of Drawings and Prints. And in this section of the exhibition, we exhibit works in pairs to demonstrate the range and the sense of artistic inspiration. For example, you'll see Michelangelo's Libyan Sibyl with an Italian illustration from an anatomical book. You'll see this beautiful drawing by Watteau of a woman holding a fan, paired with a design for a fan from revolutionary France. And then this colorful, densely patterned color lithograph by Vuillard, paired with a sample of Wiener Werkstätte wallpaper to show the wide range in this large and educationally driven collection. The third section of the exhibition is called Princely Aspirations. And this really occurred in parallel with the section on Art for All. At the same time that the museum was investing in broad collections for the purpose of education, these trustees, led by the financier J. Pierpont Morgan, elevated their goals to collect the greatest examples of artistic achievement. You see, when the museum was founded without a collection, its early leaders were not so sure that they would be able to compete with the established European collections. Sometimes they collected second-rate examples or even copies to fulfill a desired category. But in the so-called Gilded Age, when the fortunes of industrial tycoons like Morgan or department store magnate Benjamin Altman, railroad industrialist Collis Huntington, their fortunes expanded rapidly at the same time that the fortunes of the European aristocracy were plummeting. This allowed for new opportunities to buy the kinds of trophies that these collectors most desired, first for their own private collections in many cases, and then left often by bequest to the Metropolitan Museum. Both Morgan and Altman died in 1913, and this was a particularly noticeable moment of transformation with the influx of thousands of works from their collections. It took the museum from what the author Henry James had observed in 1872 as a collection that contained no first-rate examples by any first-rate geniuses to what was observed as one of the world's greatest treasure houses, rivaling the Louvre and the Prado. So you see here not only masterpiece paintings by then blue chip artists like Vermeer and Rembrandt, but also decorative art from royal palaces, armor designed for kings and aristocrats, medieval treasures, and antiquities from Egypt to ancient China. To the rest of the world, this looked like Morgan and his compatriots were like a giant magnet, sucking away the treasures from the old world with an alarming force. And in fact, here we do consider not only the great works of art that entered our collection, but also the ways in which these collectors were able to build such collections, which were often on the backs of cheap immigrant labor and in labor conditions that we now find intolerable. So we realize in this exhibition that we can both celebrate the great moments in the museum, but also look back on them and consider how we might view them differently in our present era. The next section of the exhibition is about the museum's history of excavation. Antiquities were always an important part of the collection, as we saw with the Cypriot antiquities brought in by the first director, Cesnola. But it wasn't until 1906 that the museum was able to acquire through participating in its own excavations. Previously, it had to rely on the personal tastes of collectors or the often inconsistent art market. Excavation, however, allowed the museum to engage in archaeological activity in primarily the Middle East and to build large collections of antiquities, as well as in some cases, medieval art. This section includes a wide range of objects, from domestic wares to monumental sculpture. It includes Japanese armor, remnants of the Crusaders in Palestine, and objects from the ancient and Islamic worlds of Iraq and Iran. But here, what I draw your attention to is this incredible sculpture of Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh in Egypt. The Met excavated at her funerary temple in Thebes, led by curator and future director of the museum, Herbert Wenlock. And this was where it made some of its greatest discoveries. You see circled here in the foreground of an excavation image from 1928, 1929, fragments of sculptures of Hatshepsut, like the one that you see intact at right, that will be in the exhibition. And this is one of the great stories. We have 10 of these in the exhibition, stories about conservation. We brought these in as a way to take a deep dive into the material history of certain highlights of our collection and to demonstrate the ways that our knowledge continues to evolve long after that moment of acquisition. So the image you see here, number one, is the way that the head of Hatshepsut was discovered. Wenlock described it as a delightful face and perhaps the greatest thing that they had discovered. And through an exchange with museums in Berlin, the Met was able to bring the full sculpture back to the Metropolitan for display. But first it had to be pieced back together. Image two shows the first campaign of restoration, which sought a unified appearance, but belied the archaeological history of the object. Image three is a different campaign of restoration from 1973 that decided that the previous restoration was not always elegant in its execution and somewhat faked the appearance of the sculpture. So this campaign really brought to the fore the destruction and archaeological history of the object. Image four is the most recent campaign, which seeks a balance to restore focus to the beauty of the sculpture, but also to show evidence of its archaeological past. The next section of the exhibition is about the Met's development of its collection of American art. Even though American artists were some of the founding trustees, and American art was always part of the collection, much like with the antiquities, perhaps in part due to the prejudices of the first director, Cesnola, who called American artists humbugs, in its early years, American art primarily came into the collection through gifts and only intermittently. But with that new generation of trustees around the turn of the 20th century, and particularly under the leadership of Robert de Forest, the Met decided to dedicate itself to a representative collection of the art of its own nation. Now, this was an interesting moment from the early years of the 20th century up through the 1920s and 1930s. This is tracking with the ascendance of the United States to a global power and also a massive influx of immigrants from Europe. So this collection was formed with a very strong intention to show what it meant to be an American at this moment. It had both progressive impulses, the desire to educate, but also nationalistic motivations, the idea of conforming to a particular image of what an American should be based on the opinions of the leaders of the institution. Through a concerted effort of both exhibitions and acquisitions, the museum began to develop its collections of painting and sculpture, as well as decorative art. Artists were very important to this effort. Bryson Burroughs was a painter who was a curator of paintings at the Met and responsible for many important acquisitions. And Daniel Chester French, an important sculptor, championed the collection of sculpture at the museum. You'll see in this gallery masterpieces by Sargent, Homer, Whistler, Copley, St. Gaudens, Bessie Potter Vano, that show the range of American art that came in during this time. Another story that I love is, of course, Madame X is one of the great visitor favorites, highlights of our collection. And Sargent himself chose this work to place in the Metropolitan Museum. He sold it to the museum in 1916, and he said he supposed it was the best thing he had ever done. So this shows how much the museum had transformed from 1870 to being a place where artists really wanted to see their own work represented. The DeForests were the key champions of the decorative arts, American decorative arts at the museum. Previously, European decorative arts had been collected, but American art was not seen as having the same refinement worthy of the collection. One of the important transformative moments here was a 1909 exhibition, the Hudson Fulton exhibition, which debuted the idea of these period rooms that would show how Americans lived in different regions and at different points in time, bringing together furniture, architectural elements, decorative art, and paintings. These inspired the period rooms that would become part of the new American wing, funded by the DeForests and opened in 1924. Acquisitions came in large numbers following the exhibition and the opening of the wing. I'm showing you here a beautiful small cabinet, as well as this basin that was given by the DeForests. This is a Mexican Pueblo basin. And much like Frederick Church back in the 1890s, Emily DeForest recognized that the museum's collection of American art should not only represent the United States, but the Americas at large. It would really take about a century for this view to be incorporated, and in recent years, the collecting in the American wing has focused on Latin American art, African American art, and Native American art, incorporating those narratives in with our historic collections. But it's important to note how these visionaries laid the groundwork for development in their own time and later. The next section of the exhibition, called Visions of Collecting, is anchored in the moment of 1929, when a bequest of more than 2,000 objects from the collection of Louis Zine and Henry Osborne Havemeyer became what the director called one of the most magnificent works of art, gifts of works of art by a single individual in any museum. The collection expanded the Met's holdings in many different areas, most notably in the collection of 19th century French art, overnight transforming the museum into one of the premier destinations for Impressionism in the world. Louis Zine and Henry Havemeyer were the first and most important, arguably, collectors of Impressionism in America to establish this new taste that has become a favorite still of generations later. So you see here one of the great works by Degas that they gave to the museum. 112 works by Degas came into the museum in their bequest, where we only had one finished picture before then. There were more than 200 works of 19th century French art in their bequest. And this is an important moment in transforming, not only for the highlights of the museum, but also in pushing the museum to confront the avant-garde art of the time when it was founded. The museum had a long history of some reluctance to collect art that had not yet stood the test of time. And again, it's visionary collectors who pushed the museum forward to expand its taste. The Havemeyers were pioneers not only in collecting Impressionism, but also works from the Spanish Golden Age. Here you see this incredible painting of the Cardinal by El Greco. the colorful and modern Favreal glass of Tiffany, as well as different dimensions of Asian and Islamic art from what other Gilded Age collectors had contributed to the museum. This is also an interesting moment to look at the provocative personalities behind the formation of this collection. The Havemeyers were encouraged to explore new fields of collecting by close collaboration with artists, Tiffany for the decorative arts, and the American painter Mary Cassatt for Old Master and Impressionism. Cassatt met Louisine in the 1870s, and they formed a lifelong friendship that not only inspired much of this brilliant collection, but also a breed of activism, which I think is really interesting to look back on today. With Cassatt's encouragement, Louisine collected works of art not purely for domestic enjoyment, but works that would still be seen as transgressive and inappropriate for an upper-class American household, like nudes by Degas and Courbet. In fact, this Courbet, she said she would not display in her home lest the anti-nudist revolt, but she purchased it so that it, along with other examples, could teach American artists about painting the nude figure. So she had that idea of collecting for the benefit, particularly of artists, and inspired by artists. Another interesting dimension is that, as you see here, Louisine Havemeyer was a prominent suffragette who championed the cause of the woman's right to vote. Cassatt helped her organize an exhibition in 1915 at the New York Knoedler Gallery, where she juxtaposed the works of old masters with more modern works by Cassatt and Degas, not only to advance her political mission and to raise money for that cause, but also to advance what was still considered modern art in New York. Very important tastemakers whose vision helped transform the Met. These colorful characters are featured throughout the exhibition. The next section is called Reckoning with Modernism and looks at the ways that the museum confronted, again, the art of its time, avant-garde art, in these kinds of fits and starts. Much of this section looks at what we didn't do. The museum was very hesitant to collect abstract painting and sculpture, Cubism, for example, with the belief that, as articulated even by the secretary of the museum, Henry Watson Kent, to collect the avant-garde quickly would be to repent at leisure. Yet still there were some bright spots here. You see on the left Alfred Stieglitz, the photographer and gallerist, who made major strides in advancing the museum's definition of art. He began around the turn of the 20th century when he made a gentleman's agreement with our first director, Cesnola, that he would help to organize an exhibition abroad if Cesnola would then display his photographs as fine art in the museum. Cesnola agreed, but kind of laughed him off, famously calling Stieglitz a fanatic. Stieglitz said he was indeed a fanatic, but one who would be proven right in time. It took quite some time after Cesnola's unexpected death, but in 1928 and 1933, Stieglitz organized the donation of more than 400 photographs by himself and other artists he had exhibited in his 291 gallery in New York that formed the foundation of the museum's Department of Photographs, placing the museum actually at the forefront of recognizing photographs as fine art at the time. And Stieglitz was so pleased with himself. He said, the museum's doors have been flung open to photography. My photographs have performed the miracle. After Stieglitz died in 1946, his widow, the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, shown here in a photograph by Stieglitz from 1918 that is itself part of the exhibition and the Met's collection. O'Keeffe was responsible for distributing Stieglitz's collection of modern fine art, painting, and sculpture to museums around the country, including the Met. And these works of both American and European modernism became some of the important foundational objects in the Met's holdings of modern art. This was key because in 1929, the same year that the Met accepted the bequest of the Havemeyers, it rejected Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's collection of American modernism. 1929 was also the year that the Museum of Modern Art was founded, in many ways a reaction to what the Met was not doing uptown. We tell here the story of grappling with modernism, how the Met as an encyclopedic collection would include modern and contemporary art in its collections, including a series of moments when it considered annexing the Whitney collection, as you see in a design here, that of course never came to pass. So even though this is a section about some of those Met regrets, missed opportunities, we do show not only that the Met was perhaps a surprising leader in the field of photography, but maybe even more surprising in modern decorative arts and design, both from Europe and America. I'm showing here archival photographs from exhibitions that occurred primarily during this interwar period that were meant to inspire designers to develop modern decorative arts and design in America based on both European examples, which were added to the collection and eagerly sought, and American examples that were collected less readily, but still displayed in these very lively and unusual photographs from the Met's history. The next section of the exhibition is about World War II, which affected the museum more than any other crisis in the 20th century. You see, we'll tell many stories in this part of the exhibition, but several of the Met staff members were key to the monuments men who helped safeguard monuments in Europe after the war and return works of art that had been looted by the Nazis to their rightful owners. The director, Francis Henry Taylor, was part of the commission that established the monuments men in collaboration with Great Britain. And you see here on the left, James Rorimer, who was a curator, then director of the cloisters, and then eventually the director of the museum, who was one of the most important contributors to the monuments men effort. He's pictured here at Neuschwanstein Castle, where the Nazis had stored many works of art that they had stolen from European collections. And on the right, you see here an incredible tiny manuscript, a book of hours that he discovered in a waste paper bin. It's thought that German officers stashed it there in the hope that it would be overlooked. They sealed, when Rorimer found the book, he used a medieval seal to seal the doors shut to protect the works of art that were in that room so that no one could take them away before they could return them to their rightful owners. This work was returned to a collection in Europe, and then it was acquired at Rorimer's behest by the important collector John D. Rockefeller. Rorimer was able to use the connections he made in Europe and his knowledge of collections there to then expand particularly the medieval holdings and especially manuscripts, which had not previously been a collecting focus of the institution in the years following the war. The museum also presented exhibitions about restitution and contributed in a variety of other ways. Another key person we'll feature in this part of the exhibition is Edith Standen, who was one of the female monuments women, the only one to receive a Bronze Star for her contributions. She's pictured here at a collecting point, and on the right you see her uniform, which is part of the exhibition to tell her story of her key role in restituting works of art to European collectors. The next section, the penultimate section of the exhibition, is about the centennial era, that moment when the museum celebrated its 100th anniversary with great fanfare, but also reflection on its encyclopedic aspirations. The collections and the building expanded to reflect its own growth in the ideas of what kinds of art should be included at the museum. We explore here the 1975 Islamic art galleries, very influential around the world, and then the largest galleries devoted to Islamic art in the Western Hemisphere. We also look at the Met's rededication to Asian art through expansion of its collections of Chinese, Japanese, and Indian art primarily, and the expansion of its galleries. You see here the visitor favorite Astor Court. We also look at the acquisition of what was then called primitive art, what we now call the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, largely championed by the politician Nelson Rockefeller, who had formed a museum of primitive art that he then gave to the Metropolitan and opened as the Michael Rockefeller Wing in 1982 with great works of art from these different cultures. We look at the formation of the Department of Contemporary Art in 1967 under the young and spirited curator Henry Geldzahler, who lobbied Rorimer, then director, that it was important for the museum to engage directly with contemporary art, and that the Met, unlike its peers, the Whitney and the Museum of Modern Art, had this ability to situate contemporary art in its historical and global context, an idea that we still think about very much today. Geldzahler organized a landmark exhibition as part of the museum's centennial celebration, New York Painting and Sculpture, 1940 to 1970. You see here an installation shot from that exhibition. Above, you see Geldzahler participating in one of Klaus Oldenburg's happenings. He was very much a man about town who got to know the artist himself. You also see important works by Ellsworth Kelly, as well as Ramar Bearden, that came into the collection during this period, expanding the museum's definitions of contemporary art. This was a very lively period at the museum. There were blockbuster exhibitions, as you see here, the moment from 1963, when the Mona Lisa was exhibited at the Met, which inspired Warhol's painting of Mona Lisa that is also in the exhibition. There were headline-grabbing acquisitions. There were lavish parties, as you see here, captured by the photographer Gary Winogrand, one of those centennial celebrations at the Met. The museum engaged in new ways with contemporary artists, not only visual, but also performing artists. You see here Twyla Tharp's performance that opened the exhibition, New York Painting and Sculpture. But it was also a moment of social upheaval, not only successes, but also failures. And one of those moments that we look at is the exhibition Harlem on My Mind from 1969, when the museum set out to illustrate the artistic achievements and social culture of the New York neighborhood. But in spite of including artists and community representatives in an advisory committee, the exhibition ultimately included no original works of art, painting, sculpture, works on paper, and only documented the culture of Harlem through newspaper clippings, some documentary photographs, and a soundscape. There were many protests of the exhibition for the way that it overlooked the concerns of the Black community and Black artists. And we look at those indeed with new eyes even now at the importance of artists in expanding our understanding of what kinds of art we display and what kinds of public we serve. I think that this will be a moment that is even more significant now than we imagined it would be when we first organized the exhibition. The last section of the exhibition is called Broadening Perspectives. So this is a section that is looking at the most recent decades, where in the centennial moment, the museum felt that it had achieved its mission. It thought by the end of that period, around the time of the 125th anniversary, that it had art from all cultures, all time periods, all places, all media. But yet in recent years, we've discovered that the encyclopedic model itself has a largely Eurocentric bias. So we've looked to collect from underrepresented cultures and traditions all over the world. You see here works of Judaica. You see an Armenian gospel representing the farther reaches of the Byzantine Empire, a Tibetan Buddha representing an expanded conception of Asian art, the incredible Crown of the Andes representing Latin American art, a Pomo basket, a work of Native American art that is now displayed in the American wing, the Street Story quilt by Faith Ringgold, a work created in 1985 and acquired in 1990 that tells a story of destruction and redemption set in Harlem, and is an important icon of our expansion and efforts to collect the works of Black artists, again, which resonates so strongly in the present moment. We also look at new media. We see here the first 3D work of art acquired by the Costume Institute, a skeleton dress by Iris Van Herpen from 2011, and the first work of video art in the collection from Anne Hamilton, acquired in the early 90s. We look here at the museum's efforts to be a global collection, to engage with the world around it, to expand definitions, to constantly question, what are we exhibiting? What are we collecting? How can we best represent society at large? And some of the key figures in pushing us forward. Here I show Lowry Stokes Sims, the Met's first Black curator, who was responsible, among many things, for acquiring that work by Faith Ringgold. We also think very much about the Met's engagement with contemporary art from all over the world. I'm showing here the commissions by Kent Monkman, as well as Wangechi Mutu, that have very recently activated the Met's great architectural spaces with works that challenge the cultures and traditions of the museum. The exhibition is designed to be a walk through the past, a look behind the scenes, a look at the visitors changing over the years, the ways that the work goes on at the museum, whether installation, conservation, science, and of course, the great celebrations. Here, a moment from Diana Vreeland, the Costume Institute. Looking at all aspects of the museum, you'll get to see these lively projections on human scale down the central axis that serves as a timeline of the exhibition. And again, I very much hope that you will be able to visit us later this year. This brings us, in conclusion, to that moment that we were so excited for, where we were back in March when we were installing the exhibition. You see here, that's me clapping my hands together with glee at the great excitement that goes into installing an exhibition. I'm next to Deputy Director Andrea Bayer, who is keeping us all in line, the great leader of our exhibition, as well as one of our designers and another collaborating curator. You see here people installing a door from a palace that we'd shown in the Princely Aspirations section, as well as Ellen Atsui's monumental Dusasa II that took great collaboration from colleagues across the museum. This was such an exciting moment filled with great anticipation. And yet on March 12th, we were told that we had to cease installation. And we quickly found ourselves in what has become so poignant as an 11th transformative moment. We'd spent the past few years digging deeply into the archives to think about what moments transformed the museum. And so we were acutely aware that we were in one, that things were changing in the world around us. We carefully wrapped up the artwork. You see the galleries here, not a beautiful photograph, but a snapshot I took from that last day before we left the exhibition. And on the right, the way the galleries look now, dark, but monitored by our dedicated team of collections monitors who come into the museum to ensure the safety of the collections and the building. All of the art is safe, but the museum misses its people, and we very much look forward to reopening. Before you get to come to the museum, I encourage you to learn more if you're interested. Our catalog is available on the Met Museum store website, as well as many different digital explorations into the content of the exhibition, conservation stories that I mentioned, a video from behind the scenes, the architecture video is coming soon, and a very special audio guide that will be available both on our website and on personal devices in our galleries, narrated by Steve Martin, that brings to life many of the voices of the people that I've mentioned for you. So again, thank you for joining me on today's journey. I look forward to answering your questions, and I hope to see you in the museum in the near future. So I'll turn it over now. If you give me 1 second to stop sharing my screen.
Fabulous, Laura. There are so many interesting parts of that. And I certainly couldn't wait to hear an audio guide narrated by Steve Martin. That sounds delightful. We have some questions that have come in, and you can continue to put your questions in the Slido link that's in the chat. But we've got some most popular ones to start with. So the first question for you, Laura, was how did you guys choose the 250 plus works to put in the anniversary exhibition?
Very, very carefully. It was a great challenge, but one that we had collaboration from staff across the museum. We worked through our advisory committee to identify these 10 transformative moments. And then we asked the curatorial departments, there's 17 curatorial departments in the museum, to submit their ideas for the works of art from their collections that best represented those moments. We then worked to bring them together. We wanted to bring the works of art together in new ways that you don't see them naturally in the galleries, so that they would create new connections, make us think differently. So of course we wanted to create a beautiful presentation, but at certain points there were over 1,000 works of art under consideration for this exhibition. So we hope that you'll enjoy seeing both some of these visitor favorites, but also some of the fragile works of art, like works on paper and textiles that we can't exhibit all the time. We can only bring out periodically. So some of those great treasures have come out for this landmark occasion.
Fabulous. And the next question is, what are some of the other 10 stories about conservation that are in the exhibition?
Sure. So we have a story about Degas' little 14-year-old dancer sculpture, the way that that transformed from a sculpture that was originally in wax to bronze, and the way that it has been redressed, even with a new tutu in recent years. There's a Benin bronze that we look at. We have, let's see what else. We have the Degas pastel that you saw is a story about the careful ways that we have to conserve works of art to keep them from degrading. All kinds of things, different cultures and different stories. And 6 of those stories are already on our website. The Crown of the Andes, that's another great one. A really fun story about mount making. It's kind of a scientific story there. So I encourage you to explore those both now and when you come to the exhibition.
That sounds delightful. I saw several people in the chat said that sculpture was actually one of their favorite pieces in the Met. So I'm sure they're happy to hear that it's one of the pieces highlighted.
And that's what you'll see, in fact, in front of the window to Central Park. It's actually a touching moment that we couldn't have even exactly planned. It's this great vista in the exhibition, but you see it against the backdrop of the obelisk, which was actually created by Hatshepsut's co-ruler and successor, who then destroyed her images. So it's this really interesting moment of bringing them back together, and of course, the beautiful backdrop of Central Park.
That's so interesting. Someone wants to know, on a personal note, how and where did you start your career as a curator?
I actually started at the museum, 10 years ago, like right now. I was an intern, a summer intern at the Met, and it's been a great privilege to get to work on a series of exhibitions. My primary area is Impressionism. I've worked on shows including Impressionism, Fashion and Modernity, Seurat's Circus Sideshow, and public parks, private gardens, Paris to Provence. I did that while pursuing my PhD at the Institute of Fine Arts, which is basically across the street from the Met. So it's really been a privilege. I've worked on exhibitions for other institutions, but I've really loved being at the Met for the past, the better part of the past 10 years now.
Sounds like you're very well suited to be one of the people working on this project then. One of the other questions, we probably have time for 2 more. What do you consider the most important gift, donation, or bequest to the Met, and why?
Oh, goodness. There's no way that we could identify one most important. But I encourage you to look up on our website. It was featured in that video you saw at the beginning, the first object in the Met's collection, which was a Roman sarcophagus. An unusual object, one that actually was used in a previous anniversary. I think it was the 75th anniversary, to collect donations. It was opened up and people could drop coins into the sarcophagus. We don't do that anymore. That's not considered great practice in terms of conservation, but that's where it all started. So we look at we talk about that gift, and then even some of the most recent gifts given in honor of the 150th anniversary. One of those is an object from the Leonard Lauder Cubist collection that makes its debut in the museum now as part of the collection in honor of this exhibition.
Great. And then moving on to our last question, was it fun to sort through old archival photos of the Met? Any favorite photos that you discovered?
Yes, it was one of the great parts of the exhibition. It's so fun to see the people of the past. And I really encourage you to look up this video, Behind the Scenes in 1928, which is on the exhibition website. You get to see people from, 100 years ago almost, installing objects at the museum. That plays on loop in the exhibition, and it was playing while we were installing. And I couldn't help but notice how much has stayed the same. It's this really interesting look into all of the different kinds of work, from mount making to conservation, photography, and physically hanging the works of art. That I think is so lively and fun. And you'll see a lot more archival imagery, not only in the exhibition, but also in the book.
Amazing. We are sadly out of time for today, but I know I certainly enjoyed this talk. It was so delightful, Laura. I hope everyone who's joined us from all over the world enjoyed it as well. You can check out more Culture Festival sessions tomorrow. Our last day is the music day, so you can join a Q&A with John Lennon's sister at Strawberry Field, or end the week with some time at the ABBA Museum as well, if that strikes your fancy. Beyond the Culture Festival, you can always find more ways to experience culture, both from home and once it's safe again in your area, from out and about on the Tiqets blog. And of course, the Met website has quite a bit of information about this exhibit and their entire collection that you can explore from home and start planning your trip for when it's safe. So thank you, Laura. Thank you, the whole Met team. We hope to see all of you again soon, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.